All right, balancers. Today we are re-welcoming a guest. She was actually, fun fact, one of our first 10 guests on the show, and this will be our 140th interview or something. So I'm very excited to have her back on. She is a health at every size exercise physiologist and health coach who uses scientific fact and her personal journey to empower other women to develop permanent positive relationship with food, exercise, and their bodies. Her main mission is to help you or us on today's episode to unlearn everything about diet culture so we can create a life that feels good on the inside, not just one that looks good on the outside. It's my absolute pleasure to have you back, Sarah Liz King. A warm welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be back and chatting with you.
I know. And as we were just saying, I can't believe it's almost been, 110, 120 guest interviews since we last spoke, which is just so wild when you think about, how have I even done that many interviews? But
Yeah.
this topic, what we're going to be speaking about today, kind of as women leaning into our menstrual cycles, learning to be more intuitive, learning how to actually adapt our lives to optimize our cycle because it is a part of us, and just I feel like learn things that we really should have learned growing up. And I feel if you weren't lucky enough to have maybe a mum or a key other female figure in your life who taught you things from an intuitive point of view, it was quite clinical, our understanding and learning at school. So just to kick things off, can you give us a quick 101 refresher of the cycle overview in terms of the different phases and stages? I think I definitely need a refresher before we dive in.
Yeah, sure. So, when we talk about the menstrual cycle, it is a biphasic cycle. So, that means there's two kind of like main areas or main phases that we're looking at in terms of hormone shifts. But you can kind of think about it in four key areas. So, we're going to use a 28-day cycle as kind of our key marker. Now, people might have a different length of their cycle, but 28 days is kind of seen as the quote unquote average. So, day one of your cycle actually marks the first day of your period. So, the day that you start bleeding, right? And people's bleeds can last anywhere from 2 to 5, 7 days. And that is the stage of our cycle where our hormone levels are our lowest. It is also part of our follicular phase. So when I was talking about that biphasic, how our cycle is biphasic, that's kind of the first phase of our cycle. So during this stage, obviously our hormones are lowest when we're having our period, but as we're kind of progressing through day 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, our body actually starts to increase those hormone levels back up again. And the predominant hormone in the first phase of our cycle, or our follicular phase, is a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone. So, follicle stimulating hormone does exactly what it says it does. It stimulates a follicle in our ovaries to start maturing. Now, as it affects that ovary starts to, as it gets bigger, produce more estrogen. Right. And this has a little bit of a feedback loop that helps follicle stimulating hormone kind of keep doing its job until it reaches that dominant stage. Now, this is where our brain goes, cool, FSH is high, estrogen levels are high, and then another hormone surge happens, and that is luteinizing hormone. So, luteinizing hormone helps basically with ovulation. It is the key hormone that spikes and tells our body to release that egg from our ovary to travel down into our fallopian tube. So, that whole process from day one to when you ovulate, roughly 14 days.
And that's
Ovulation,
our follicular phase.
that's our follicular phase, right? And then once we've ovulated, follicle stimulating hormones kind of done its job. Estrogen levels aren't quite as high, but we have a second hormone that comes into play, and that one is called progesterone. So, progesterone, basically, once we've ovulated, our body has this kind of like downstream effect of different hormones being released, with progesterone being the predominant one. And its job is to make sure that the lining of our uterus stays nice and thick and cushy for potential implantation. Right. So if our egg gets fertilized in that kind of like window of opportunity, which is kind of roughly 24 hours that egg is viable, but you can get pregnant beyond that window because sperm last and live a longer time in our bodies. But progesterone kind of keeps that uterine lining thick and juicy. And then if implantation doesn't occur, about 14-ish days later, our hormone levels drop again. And that's when we get another day one of the next cycle. So that second part of our cycle from our ovulation to again the next day one of our period is our luteal phase. Okay, so those
Perfect.
are your basic phases of your cycle.
Perfect. And I remember the last time we spoke, you really beautifully spoke about these phases almost like seasons. And like seasons, in each different period, or I should say stage of our period, you need different things. And I really love and appreciate learning about this from both a diet and an exercise point of view. And since we last spoke, I think I was doing weights training at the time we spoke last, but I have in the last couple months been doing more program style. So kind of like 8 weeks of training where I'm monitoring my weights and trying to get stronger. And so for me, I noticed such a huge shift in my strength and my energy because I'm actually tracking it. It's not like I'm just rocking up to the gym and just doing kind of a random thing however I feel on the day. I've literally noticed, such a drastic shift that week before my period. That's for me the week where I just feel, like I just have no strength. It's almost like I can't activate my core. And I understand obviously there's a lot going on internally. But can you just talk to us? Maybe let's start on the exercise front. At what points in the month? I mean, just from my experience, it's kind of like after my period's finished, like after that first week, I kind of feel my strength regaining. And then it's the week before I personally feel a bit of a crash. How does that correlate to the actual science, what's going on? And I remember last time you shared like different types of intensity or exercises that are best at different parts of our cycle. So I'd love for you to just talk to that. And then we can have a little chat about the diet side.
Yeah, definitely. So the last time we spoke, we were kind of just starting to see a little bit more of this research come out around training around your cycle. And it was so interesting and so fascinating. I think so many people took an interest in it, which is really great. What I will say is the research surrounding training around your menstrual cycle is still very much in its infancy. So some of the studies say one thing, and then another study counteracts it and says something else. So, whenever we're thinking about exercise and our menstrual cycle, it's really important to take what we found so far with a very big pinch of salt and ask ourselves, yes, this is what the research might correlate to right now, but this might not be how my body feels
Sure.
at every part of my cycle, like you have been doing, tracking your energy levels, tracking how your performance and your progression with your training is going and how you're recovering and how you're feeling, not just within the gym, but then in those hours outside of the gym can be some of the greatest research that you do for your own body and for your own training. But in general, some of the things that we do know is estrogen, the hormone estrogen, is very helpful in the process of protein synthesis. So, not just good for our bones, but also good for our muscles. So, you can kind of look at your cycle and go, well, estrogen is the highest at the beginning stages of our cycle in that follicular phase. So, some research does point to the fact that we may have better adaptations should we prioritize more progressive overload in that first part of our cycle. Does that mean that we can't gain muscle or make progress in the second half? No. It's just been comparing what if we push people really, really hard in that first phase versus pushing them really, really hard in that second phase? What are the
So
differences?
interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. So that's really a good one to kind of keep in your back pocket to kind of go, is that the case for me? Do I feel stronger during the first phase of my cycle? Can I notice any shifts in my energy level or ability to recover or how I feel mentally when I'm in that first phase? Ovulation, obviously, that's when we get that peak in our hormones, luteinizing hormones, also when our testosterone is highest. And again, there's some research to say that we might be at slightly higher risk of injury, right? So ACL injuries seem to be higher when people are around that ovulatory period. Does that mean that we shouldn't be playing dynamic sports when we're ovulating? Not necessarily, but it's good to know if you are someone that is quite injury prone, or you have had several kind of stress injury. You could kind of use that information to kind of go like, oh, is there any correlation to when my injuries happen and my cycle, or how I feel coordination wise in my cycle? And maybe I need to do some more like stability kinds of warm ups or other kinds of movements just to make myself feel more protected. Now, the luteal phase is the phase that everyone kind of wants to bag on because progesterone can often make us feel less energized, a little bit more lethargic. And so I guess there has been this trend where you see online that everyone says like, oh, this is the time where you should hibernate and save your energy and don't push yourself. And what I will say is if you feel like that at any stage in your cycle, of course, listen to your body. You shouldn't be pushing yourself in the gym if you feel like it's not going to be advantageous to your overall training and to your overall recovery. But that doesn't mean that we should completely kind of go for every 2 weeks of the month. We just shouldn't train
Gonna
because
kick back.
yeah, we shouldn't just kick back. What I think this is the point where you have to go every single day that you train. You should be kind of tuning into how you feel and using
Mhm.
that information to fine tune your training in the moment, and also recognize that month to month you might respond differently. And adjusting your training doesn't mean completely throwing in the towel. It might be adjusting how many exercises you do, or how many sets, or the
Mhm.
intensity that you do that day, or giving yourself an extra rest day before your next training session. And then when it gets to your period, again, there's no reason why you can't train while you're on your period. I think that's such a big myth that women should abstain from exercise while they're having their menstrual cycle or while they're having their period.
It actually makes me feel better if I
Yeah.
train when I'm on it.
Yeah, so there's a lot of science that shows it helps with a lot of symptoms that people get. So, like menstrual
Like pain?
cramps,
Yeah.
pain. Yep. It can help alleviate a lot of that because that blood flow and circulation just helps us generally feel a lot better. So, there's no issues, no like at all with training exactly the same during your period. Of course, if you don't feel well, don't go to the gym. Maybe you go for a walk. Maybe that
Mm.
is the time you do something lower intensity, but it doesn't mean that you need to abstain from exercise at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of this is just like information and education so that you can then correlate your understanding of how our hormones work to your lived experience. Because I think like you rightly pointed out, like for me, sometimes I'll have, if I'm very stressed out, I'll have a very more intense experience of my menstrual cycle that month. The highs and the lows will be a lot more intensified, as will my energy, for example. And of course, like our hormones in our cycle are one aspect, but then there's your sleep, your level of stress. There's so many things that come into it that might mean you actually might not have energy in that follicular phase. So, of course, all of this is just additional resources and information for people to consider, especially if you're trying to align your training with your cycle. I have a very specific question. It kind of, for me particularly. So I'm doing kind of progressive overload from week to week. And when I hit that fourth week, which the way my period falls is the last week of the month, it's the week before my period. And I have to sometimes, depending on how I feel, half my weights, depending on the exercise. So like if I'm doing a squat on the bar, when I have to, when I have to really engage my core, that's a move I have to like literally half my weight on. But something like a hip thrust, I'm okay. So in terms of, I sometimes feel like mentally, am I like kind of delaying my progress? But I'm very in tune with my body, and I like to just not push myself outside of what I'm comfortable doing. But do you have any tips in terms of someone who is training with progressive overload, how to actually optimize that fourth week? Is it actually good to have a week where you pull back the weights, or should we change your exercises? So for example, I feel more comfortable doing a different style of movement. Just any thoughts kind of around that to continue on like a strength upward path?
Yeah, and I love that question because this is something that we talk to our clients about all the time in our online training programs. Periodization is critical for you to have increases in your performance and your strength gains and building muscle. And periodization basically means that you should go through cycles of pushing really hard and having cycles and times and breaks where you pull back, which is called your deload week,
Hmm.
right? And you should be deloading every kind of 4 to 6 weeks, depending on what kind of training you're doing and what you're working towards. And you can coincide that deload week very, very easily with your period. If you notice, or the week before your period, if you notice that is when your strength drops, because so much of training is very taxing on your nervous system beyond your hormones, right?
Yeah.
And your nervous system needs that time to kind of like have a low moment, reset, so that you can have this general upwards trend over time. So I
Hmm.
kind of, if you're a visual person, you can kind of think of little squiggle marks in circles slowly going up. So we have that little blip where we go up and push, and then we come back down and reset so that again we can go up and push. So that looks like exactly what you've been doing. So having your load 50% of what you normally do, and then keeping that consistent for the whole week. So whatever training sessions you're normally doing, deloading for the whole week, really just kind of like pulling back. And then you'll notice when you get to that next session, when you are pushing higher again, that in that 3 week block that you're pushing, you'll probably feel so much better and be able to make that strength gain again. So that
Hmm.
next time when you're having your load again, the halfway point, that 50%, is actually higher. So you're
Mm.
still making gains.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and that is something I was aware of, kind of deload weeks. I just wasn't sure if every 3 weeks and then having the fourth week as deload was too frequent. But I do like the idea, and I kind of have been doing it because I physically can't push any harder in those sessions in those weeks. But the thing for anyone who's kind of hearing about deloading for the first time is you still do the same program, you still do the same training. So whether it's Pilates or HIIT, you just reduce either the intensity or, like you said before, maybe it's the amount of exercise or the amount of reps. So you stay in that routine. I mean, there are some days I wake up, I'm like, I need to go for a walk today. That's more of like a mental body alignment type decision. And you can sub things out, but it's good to keep that routine where you can. I had a couple of listeners in the community ask about diet specifically. I know we spoke about it on our previous episode, which I will link in the show notes, but just on a very high level, what are the ways we should be thinking about our diet from the lens of our cycle? Now, I know for a lot of people, cycles may not be regular, but let's just frame this discussion in terms of just the phases that you've shared, just for simplicity's sake. Are there things that actually help different stages of the cycle, or is it more types of food, like categories that are beneficial? Just kind of keen to hear your thoughts on that. We've kind of touched on training, and then obviously diet's another big part of health.
Yeah, so there's not too much variation that you kind of need between the different phases of your cycle when it comes to nutrition, right? I think sometimes when we're trying to really optimize our health and we go into the nitty gritty of everything, can sometimes go in with the lens of a little bit of confirmation bias. So trying to go seek out the things that we think are going to be the best for us. Um, but you just want to think about your menstrual cycle as this kind of report card. So it's telling you every single month if things are a-okay or if there are things that are really off for you. I think some things that can be really, really helpful in general are obviously getting a variety of whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. So if we kind of look at general health and like good gut health, we know that like eating 30 different kind of plant-based foods a week, and plant-based foods means like whole grains, nuts and seeds, legumes, fruits and vegetables, all different kinds of things. That is ticking your box for good gut health in general, right? And then we can kind of think of, okay, we want to have general kind of anti inflammatory eating, right? Because if we're getting really severe kind of premenstrual syndrome type of symptoms, or even really horrific period symptoms, sometimes there are things that we can change lifestyle wise, but they don't need to be drastic, right? You can kind of think of the Mediterranean diet as a really good segue to kind of follow. So lots of oily fish and olive oil and
Music to my
legumes.
ears. I
Yeah.
love olive oil.
Yeah. So that's a really simple way that you can be eating. Now, if you are someone that's really prioritizing your strength training and you want to be improving your muscle mass, it's just generally making sure that you're getting an adequate intake of protein from both plant and animal based sources, just to make sure that you have the actual nutrition to grow those muscles. And then there's like little things that you can avoid. So we know in terms of fertility, that like plastics and things like that can contain hormone disrupting chemicals which aren't that great for us, which means really simple things like if you're storing food in the fridge, store it in a glass container, put it on a plate to reheat it rather than keeping it in the plastic takeaway container. That's a really simple one that you can do. And then even when it comes to processed foods, you don't need to eliminate them completely. One of the things is that I will say is in your second phase, which is your luteal phase, when we have that progesterone hormone at a higher concentration, it has an impact on our metabolism. So it increases our body temperature, it increases how much heat we give off, and that means that we are burning more energy. So you'll likely feel hungrier,
Can
right? And
confirm, yes.
yeah, that's the typical time where we usually feel really fatigued and we want to reach for really quick energy sources. And what are really quick energy sources? Things that are typically higher in sugar and higher in fats. And again, nobody's going to say don't have your chocolate or whatever your, you know,
Go-to is.
preferred go-to is, but you just want to think about like what are some ways that I can balance my blood sugars in general. Can I make sure that my meals have a type of slow digesting carbohydrate and some healthy fat and some good quality protein, because that is going to keep me so much more satisfied than just
Mhm.
reaching for the snack that you're really craving. So have something that is going to, like, if you're wanting some chocolate, if that's really going to fulfill you, I always think about like what can I have with the chocolate that's actually going to give me some staying power. So maybe I'll have like a yogurt bowl with some fruit and some nut butter, and then I'll have some chocolate with that because I know that's going to give me so much staying power than just reaching for the chocolate on its own.
For sure. And just kind of on this part of the cycle overview, so just that part just before where we're requiring maybe additional calories, what do you advise your clients in terms of like the most satiating options we can go for? Just as I remember when I used to be in an office 5 days a week, I used to just like having things that I knew were easier to go to. For me, it was like rice crackers and peanut butter, things you can just have in the drawer. I'm just curious on your, like, in your expertise, what do you find are the most satiating in those moments? Because for me, it's like always high carb. That's what I'm craving, like more carbs.
Yeah. And look, we do need those carbs. And I think having a good, I'm a snack queen. So like having a well-equipped snack drawer or cupboard at your house is going to be really
Pre-rolled
helpful.
protein balls.
Yeah, exactly. So things that you can keep on hand that are very shelf stable if you're at the office are raw or like dry roasted nuts are a really, really good one. Different types of fruit. Like you said before, any type of like whole grain cracker and some kind of protein to go with that, whether that be peanut butter, cheese is a really, really good one. Obviously, you have to keep cheese in the fridge, but most offices have a fridge. And that's going to give you a little bit more staying power. Other things, if you're plant based, are things like, roasted edamame beans, or you could do,
Like
like I
a
said before,
dip.
yeah, like a hummus, carrots, crackers type situation. But
Hmm.
basically, you want to think about your staying power, particularly when it comes to snacking. It's making sure that you have some combination of either a protein and like a really good fat and fiber source. So that kind of looks like your hummus, where that's made with like olive oil and tahini, and then maybe something
Chickpeas.
chickpeas, yeah. And then you've got your fiber, which is your, carrots, celery, whatever you choose to dip, and your carbohydrate, which would be like a cracker if you decided that was what you needed and met your energy requirements. Or you would have some kind of like protein and carbs. So maybe some yogurt and fruit, right? Having
Yeah.
like one thing on its own, like having carbs just on their own, can sometimes mean that those, like the carbohydrates get digested quite quickly. So maybe we get hungrier faster. So just having a little bit
Sure.
of fat, fiber, or protein
Bit
in
more
there can
balanced.
help us just feel more satiated from that snack.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. Having like a bit of a full meal as opposed to just a one
Yeah.
aspect of it.
I
Yeah,
always
yeah.
tell people, like in the afternoon, like 10 almonds, or if you're counting your almonds, please stop counting your almonds. But like a handful of nuts is probably not going to cut it. Like make yourself a little snack plate. That'll probably
Yeah.
get you
Bit of
through.
yogurt, bit of fruit. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll
Then
get
add
you
the
through
nuts.
much better, especially if you're training after work before dinner.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any thoughts? This is just something that's popped to mind, kind of has come up in passing conversations on cold, like refrigerated foods versus warm foods. Does that have any benefit or detriment at any part of the cycle? You know, some people like, don't have
Yeah.
cold water, have room temperature. Just curious on your thoughts.
Look, I don't know too much about it, but I would say if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Our body's very good at homeostasis or regulating things. So whatever you consume, whether that be hot or cold, your internal system is going to make it the temperature that it needs to be. It probably has to use a little bit more energy to take things from cold to the temperature that it needs to be, but marginally. I would say probably more beneficial is to just go with what's going to feel good for you. So
Mm.
if something feels like warm and comforting and inviting and that's what you need, go for that. Or if you're
Mm.
in your luteal phase and you just feel like I get really hot and bothered that week before when I'm sleeping. So sometimes before I go to bed, I'm like, I just want something cold. I just want something to cool me down. So go with how you feel more than like what everyone's talking about in terms of like, you should only eat this at this
Yeah,
temperature or
sure.
that at that temperature, because I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference.
Yeah, I think if it's a blanket statement about something you're experiencing, it's probably wrong in the sense that, everyone's experience is so unique. I think I just was more thinking about how I get drawn to like wanting a hot water bottle and something warm, especially like pre day one of my period. So it's
Mm.
just wondering if internally having like a warm soup or something would correlate with that.
I think definitely from a psychological perspective. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it's got to do something, right? All right, before I let you go, I just want to ask you about more on the mood side. So, obviously, we have all these hormonal shifts happening. Now, I feel like, I mean, I feel pretty lucky that my period is like textbook. It's the same day every month, sometimes even the same time. Like, I know when it's happening. And I have this one day before I get my period where I'm like an emotional mess and I have to just like cry and let it out. And it's always the day or two before. And I just wanted to know, do you have any tips or ways you help your clients work around these really like, because they can be quite dramatic, the hormonal mood swings. And I don't ask this question to avoid these days happening because I almost feel like it needs to happen for me to just release and I always feel better for it. But just in general, with managing mood that comes up from those hormonal swings, do you have kind of any thoughts there?
Yeah. So the first thing is you're 100% right. So our hormones have an impact on our sex organs, obviously, but there are receptors in other parts of our body that they work on, like our brain, right? So estrogen can often make us feel really elevated and good. Sometimes like when you're ovulating, you're like, sometimes you'll like check your app and be like, why do I feel so good today? And you're like, oh, maybe I'm
Mm.
like 2 days away from ovulation and I just like feel amazing. That's a really common experience a lot of people have. Similarly, when you're in that luteal phase where progesterone is higher, people's brains have different responses to all of these different hormones, but some people feel very sensitive to the effects of progesterone, which can create these kind of premenstrual mood shifts, right? And they can range from mild to quite severe for a lot of people. For people that have really severe impacts of hormones during that luteal phase, they might be diagnosed with something called PMDD, so premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It is not just severe PMS, it's classified as a mental health condition because it is something that needs
Wow.
to be attended to. But for us, most of us that just feel pretty crappy in those 3 to 4 days beforehand and just want to cry our eyes out, I think it can be really helpful to look at how you are planning what's going on in your life during that time. And this is something that I have learned from my my own psychologist, who is like, probably don't overload yourself in terms of work and lots of social things around the time that you know you're going to be less resilient should kind of something waver, right? Give yourself a little
Hmm.
bit more space to breathe. I think that can be one of the biggest tips, right? And the second one is give yourself enough rest and some radical acceptance that, hey, we're human beings. We're not like men who experience a hormonal shift that kind of resets every 24 hours. We experience a shift that goes over 28 days. So you're not going to be the same person. You're not going to have the same emotional responses. And that's kind of the part of the beauty of being a person that has a period and gets to go through this sometimes delightful, sometimes not as delightful change in hormones every 28 days. But I don't think we can avoid it completely. I think we can just be mindful of what is going on for us at that time and give ourselves more room to breathe so that we can have the good cry, reset, know
And
that we're
start
not going
again.
crazy because our period's coming in 2 days and start again.
Yeah, it's one of those things, right? Then when you actually are on day one, you're like, oh, I knew I wasn't, I knew I wasn't
Yeah.
meant like crazy. I knew something was happening. But no, I think that tip was exactly what I was after, because it's not, like I said, it's not so much about avoiding these moments, because you have to have that radical acceptance that it's a part. There's a hormonal shift. It's going to have an impact on you. You can't just go through unscathed and like not impacted by it. I accept that.
Yeah.
But I really like the idea of, especially if you have a regular cycle, or if you can notice when your body is moving into that phase, to clear your schedule, to take away things that are, on the podcast, we talk about them as your non-negotiables. You have two types of priorities. You've got non-negotiables, which are things you need to do to feel like you every day or every week. And then you've got things that they're still priorities, but they're more wants. They're things that we just add for extras, a bit of,
Yeah.
of a bonus. Those are the things we can remove, peel back, and just have almost like a clean,
Yeah.
open schedule. I think that's a great tip, especially if you know how you are at that point of the month. So I think that's brilliant and plays really nicely into the whole idea of life balance too.
Yeah. And on to what you said about the non negotiables, I phrase it, or I use this term called your BAM. So your bare ass minimum. Going back to your BAM or your bare ass minimum, when you know you just need to kind of like have quiet moments, can take the pressure off yourself. And it also gives you like a little bit of a fallback of, these are what I know I need to feel like a good functioning human for the next few days, but I don't need to overwhelm myself. So
Yeah,
if you can
it
go
gives
back to
you,
those, yeah, it gives you something to kind of fall back on.
It gives you the baseline. You're not overextending that. I love that. I think that's a great place to end our chat for today. I want to thank you so much for coming on, joining me again. It'd be great to have you on again, maybe another 100 episodes, and see what new research has come out at that time, and where you are with your clients and your business. I always love keeping up to date. So I'll pop links to your social media below. But thank you so much for your time.